Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ian Ross, and as Chairman of the Board of Kazia Therapeutics, I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting. At this time, it's now 10 a.m. in Sydney. A quorum is present, and I formally declare the 2022 Annual General Meeting of Kazia Therapeutics Limited open. I'm aware that feelings are running high at the moment, and I'd like to outline how I plan to conduct this meeting so that we address the concerns of shareholders and we hear from management, and we do that in an orderly fashion. Now, we've changed the order of events this year, and after this introduction, I'm going to call on the CEO to present to the meeting before we start addressing the formal agenda. Can I ask that you hold any questions on the business and ask them at the end of James's presentation? We'll deal with questions on the resolutions at the appropriate time during the meeting. We will be dealing with questions in the room and online, and Kate, as Company Secretary, will be assisting me with this. Over the last couple of years, we've done these all virtually, and I've sat in London and read a script and nobody's noticed I'm doing it. So I do apologise because I am going to have to read this because it is a formal meeting. So as set out in the notice of meeting, the 2022 Annual General Meeting is being held as a hybrid meeting. We have shareholders attending in person here in the room. Also, we have shareholders joining us virtually via the dial-in. The virtual attendees have access to the slides and the audio for the AGM proceedings, but will be able to access the video, audio, and slides for the CEO presentation. All of the directors of the company are present, and as is the Company Secretary, and they will be able to speak at the meeting. When you registered for the meeting, you were asked to nominate whether you are a shareholder or a guest. Shareholders are able to ask questions at the meeting and to vote, while other attendees are only able to listen and watch the proceedings. For virtual attendees, if you wish to ask a question, there's a facility on your screens to do so. Questions will be sent to Kate as our moderator, who will ask the questions at the appropriate time in the meeting. In-person attendees can, of course, ask a question in the meeting. To do so, please raise your shareholder voting card at the relevant time. As I've already requested, please ask your business-related questions after James has finished his presentation, and questions regarding the resolutions can be asked during the formal proceedings. If we experience any technical difficulties, we may pause the meeting for a few minutes to allow for that to be dealt with, depending on how long it's going to take and who it impacts. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce my fellow directors. On the end, our Managing Director, Dr. James Garner. Next, Non-Executive Director, Mr. Bryce Carmini, and Non-Executive Director, Stephen Coffey in the centre. Also, we have Kate, who is our moderating this meeting. And we also have Gabrielle Heaton, who's our Director of Finance and Administration and Treasurer, just showing how lean we are. We have one person doing all those things. Also in attendance is our Company Secretary, Kate, who will act as the moderator. I'd also like to welcome Medina Aziz from the company's auditors, Grant Thornton. Now, before I ask James to present, I will take a moment to outline the process for asking questions. Can't wait until we turn to the old days of just everybody being in the room. Online attendees can submit questions at any time. To ask a question, select the Q&A tab at the top of the Computershare platform. At the top of that tab, there is a section for you to type your question. Once you have finished typing, please hit the send button. Please note that while you can submit questions from now on, they will be addressed at the relevant time in the meeting. Please also note that your questions may be moderated, or if we receive multiple questions on the same topic, we'll amalgamate them. And for that reason, we may not actually identify who asked the question. For those shareholders who wish to ask a verbal question, an audio questions facility is available during this meeting. To use this service, please pause the broadcast on the Computershare platform and follow the instructions on the Q&A page under the heading Asking a Question Verbally. You will listen to the meeting on this page while waiting to ask your question. If you have any issues using the system, please return to the Computershare platform. I should note that the stream you're viewing is subject to a 20-second delay from the live proceedings, and as a consequence, there may be a delay in asking your question. For this reason, we also encourage shareholders to ask questions via the text facility if possible, so that they do not miss any of the live meeting when switching to the audio platform to ask the question. Finally, due to the time constraints, we may not get to answer all your questions. If this happens, we will obviously answer them in due course via email, posting responses on our website. I'll now invite James, our CEO and Managing Director, to present to the meeting.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome again to the 2022 Annual General Meeting of Kazia shareholders. It's wonderful, as you've heard, to be able to do this in person. Once again, see some familiar faces in the room. And of course, we have a number of shareholders who've joined us online. Really grateful for your time this morning. And I'd like to just thank in passing as well our corporate counsel at Baker McKenzie for their very generous hospitality and hosting us this morning. It's been an eventful year for Kazia, and there's a great deal for us to discuss this morning. So I want to make sure that we make efficient use of everybody's time. I'm going to give a short presentation this morning, just about a dozen or so slides. And I'm going to ask, if I may, that we save questions to the end of the presentation. Some of them may be addressed in the presentation, and at the very least, it'll hopefully provide some useful background for our discussions thereafter. So a brief presentation, and then, as I say, if we can save the questions till the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. And next slide again, please. I just wanted to start with some key points of the year, just to outline some of the things that have been going on for Kazia this year. And this is a sort of greatest hit slide that I presented a little bit of last year. And as you can see here on the slide, we've had over 350 patients now treated with paxilosib in our clinical trial program. That number last year was about 200, so we've almost doubled the number of patients now that have been exposed to the drug through our clinical trials. And that's an important number because as regulatory agencies look at the drug in the context of potential approval, they like to see a critical mass of patients that have been treated. And I think we're starting to get into the sort of range where we have enough data to talk credibly to regulatory agencies about the drug. We've had 10 data readouts this year at international conferences, and we'll touch on a couple of those in a moment, but it's been actually a very productive year for us in terms of data. We've learned a lot about our drug, and we've had the opportunity to put it in front of a great number of clinicians and researchers. 2 special designations from the US FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, 2 regulatory designations, really denote partly, I think, the credibility that attaches to the drug from a regulatory standpoint. There is currently clinical trial activity in 8 countries for paxilosib, so an incredibly broad range of work that's going on. And as you can see here, we've had 2 clinical trials that advanced, have graduated, if you like, to a second stage of their development. It's very fashionable at the moment for clinical trials to be run in these sort of multi-stage designs. 2 of our trials have progressed. One of them, of course, has not, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. And 9 ongoing clinical trials across the 2 drugs in our pipeline. So again, just a huge breadth of work ongoing with paxilosib. We won't talk a great deal today about EVT-801. We'll have a great deal more to say about that, I think, in the new year. But just a note in passing that progress is going well there. We have, as you know, a phase 1 clinical trial underway in Europe. And we have to date had about 85 patient weeks of treatments, a slightly cumbersome measure, but it just gives you a sense that that trial has been moving nicely. And over 24 CT scans now that have been evaluated as part of that. We don't really have a lot of data to share with you today, but as I say, I think we'll have more to say about that study next year. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to just zoom out and try and show you the total picture of what's been happening with paxilosib this year. And this is a very dense slide, and just say that all our slides today are available on the website, so it's easy to go back and look at this material afterwards. But this is a list of all the work that's going on with paxilosib. And I won't kind of go through in detail here, but I just pick out a few points. The first line on the slide shows The study that we have ongoing with Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in combination with radiotherapy for brain metastases. And we reported great data from that in August. This study showed every patient responding to the combination of Paxlovid and whole brain radiotherapy. To give you a point of reference, about 20 to 40% of patients respond to the radiotherapy by itself. So when we're seeing evidence of clinical response in every single patient, this is really a knockout result. And so this got invited for an oral presentation at an ASCO conference in August. Sadly, it came 4 days after the GBM Agile news, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's got a little drowned out, but this is really stellar data, and I think as in one leap opened up brain metastases as an indication for us. Another brain metastases study, the Alliance study that's being run with multiple drugs, that has advanced to a second stage in breast cancer brain metastases. Now, this study is blinded. We don't have data to show. It's a common refrain, I'm afraid, today, but we know that it's advanced to this second stage in breast cancer brain mets, ongoing in lung cancer and in other cancers. But again, it only advances if the drug's showing some evidence of activity. So I think a very positive signal there. And by the way, the green ticks on this slide are data readouts that have been positive. We've got a third study in brain mets, ongoing breast cancer brain mets at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. I'll be honest and say this study is moving like treacle on a cold day. It's been slow progress, but we did sit down with the investigator in September. He's promising us great things in the near future. So I think we'll have more to say about that study before too long, but for now, that's just ongoing. GBM Agile, we'll talk about more in a few slides' time, but I think the best way I can describe the news that we heard from that study in August is that it's ambiguous. We have no data from the study. It remains ongoing. There are still patients being treated with a drug. There are still patients in follow-ups, evolving day by day. And at the moment, nobody, apart from an inner group of perhaps half a dozen statisticians, has any visibility to data at all. So I think the best we can say about this study is we don't know what's happening there. But as I say, we'll talk more about that in a moment. But for now, we've just put a kind of amber question mark against that. And then as you can see here, DIPG, we've had some positive results there. The PNOC study, the phase 2 study that's ongoing with our drug in this childhood brain cancer, has expanded internationally. It's now opened at 2 sites in Australia, shortly to open in several European countries and in Israel. And suffice to say, these studies don't expand to multiple countries unless something is happening. These people aren't inclined to waste their time. So we think this is a good signal from this study. And again, we'll expect to see some more data out of this next year. And then finally, towards the bottom of the slide here, some really great preclinical data that's current, which has really opened some new areas of possibility for the drug throughout the year. Some stellar data in melanoma in September at the Society for Melanoma Research annual conference. Some very promising data in ATRT, atypical teratoid rhabdoid tumors, a rare childhood brain cancer. And then finally, of course, many people in the room will be familiar with the work of Professor Matt Dunn up in Newcastle at the Hunter Medical Research Institute. And he's actually presenting this week at the Society for Neuro-Oncology annual meeting, his latest data with Paxlovid in DIPG. So a great deal happening. And of all the things that we reported this year, I would say in aggregate, we're 7 for 8. We've had 7 projects that are unambiguously showing positive results, and 1 where I think the jury's out, and of course that's GBM Agile. And I'd say that drug development is a test where you never score 100%. So in aggregate, this is actually pretty good going. I think we got a lot of the wrong kind of attention in August, but I would say, to borrow a line from Mark Twain, that reports of Paxlovid's demise have been greatly exaggerated. I've been in oncology drug development for over 20 years. This is not the picture of a drug that is failing. Next slide, please. And you don't have to take that from me, because we work, of course, with some of the leading experts in the world in brain cancer, and they continue to support the development of this drug wholeheartedly. So we announced earlier this year the formation of our scientific advisory board, John DeGruy and Patrick Wen, they're two of the leading experts in glioblastoma, very senior investigators in the GBM Agile study. Priscilla Brastianos at Harvard Medical School, one of the world experts in brain metastases. Alan Olivero, an expert in the development of PI3K inhibitors, the class to which our drug belongs, and in fact, the inventor of paxilosib. We're meeting with these clinicians tonight in the US, and they continue to support the drug enthusiastically and wholeheartedly. We will be discussing with them its progress across all the different diseases that I've spoken about. So we still command very, very enthusiastic engagement from the clinicians that we work with. Next slide, please. And I think, stepping aside from glioblastoma, I think one of the signature refrains of this year has been that paxilosib has really started to demonstrate its credentials in a broad range of diseases. We've spoken for the last couple of years about the fact that we really have always seen this drug as more than a glioblastoma drug, more even than a brain cancer drug. We've seen this as a very, very broadly applicable cancer drug. But I think this year we finally started to deliver on those expectations. And what's resolved, I think, over the course of this year is three indications, three disease areas that we see as core to the development of the drug: brain metastases, an enormous potential market opportunity, some 200,000 patients a year in the United States. Obviously, 3 ongoing clinical trials there. Glioblastoma, you've heard plenty from me in previous years about that. A smaller opportunity, about 13,000 patients a year, 2 ongoing clinical trials there. And then childhood brain cancer, and in particular, this group of diffuse midline gliomas. That's a kind of newer term for DIPG, but for today, we can regard these two as roughly equivalent. A smaller opportunity, thankfully, about 800 kids a year in the United States, but nevertheless, a very, very important opportunity. And in economic terms, we do have the ability here to earn this priority review voucher from FDA. As previous AGM attendees will recall, this is something that's given to incentivize the development of drugs for children. They sell on the secondary market for about $110 million at present. So 3 lead indications that have emerged very clearly for the drug, positive data across all of them, and then a whole host of other opportunities coming up behind those: primary CNS lymphoma, ATRT, melanoma, breast cancer even. So a lot of work going on behind the scenes in these other diseases. Next slide, please. And I think the beauty of the paxilosib program is that it's at a stage of maturity where we're not talking here by and large about experiments in a handful of mice or in a petri dish. We're talking about clear clinical programs, each of which has a path to market. So if we look at the diffuse midline gliomas, the childhood brain cancers, we'll be seeing data we anticipate in the first half of calendar 2023. And on the basis of that, I think we'll start making decisions about how best to move that drug forward towards a commercial market. And I would say that study is fully funded. It's externally funded by grants and by the academic organizations that are running it. So we have no further material financial commitments there. Glioblastoma, we'll see data from the GBM Agile study in the second half of next year. And again, that study, as it turns out, is now fully funded. We have no material further financial commitments for that study either. And then brain metastases, a little bit further behind. This is a newer entrant to the paxilosib portfolio. And we're looking at how we can get that into some sort of pivotal study for registration next year. We had a great meeting in September with some of the leading experts in brain metastases in the US, and they encouraged us to waste no time whatsoever in getting this into a clinical trial. So we're just talking through how to do that. Now, we'll have to work out how to fund that as well, but we have some very warm leads that hopefully should substantially support that study through external funding. So overall, notwithstanding the news that we had in August, I think this really, or I hope that this paints a picture of a program that's actually in pretty rude health and that has a great deal of work going across a very, very broad range of indications. Now, of course, this is not reflected in the share price of the company as it stands today. And I realize this has been an enormous frustration for shareholders, as it has been for all of us. And And if we go to the next slide, please, I'd like to start talking a little bit about why some of that is. So this slide is a complex one. On the right hand, it shows our share price over the last few years. And as of yesterday, we're trading around about 10 cents on ASX. We've had some long dark nights of the soul before in Kazia. I think the period from 2018 to 2020 was a pretty challenging one for all of us as well. And it's been incredibly frustrating that we've given back a lot of the gains that we've made over the last 2 years since then, in fact, trading a little bit below. Now, part of what's happening is clearly that this is one of the worst markets for biotech companies that we've seen in decades. And the bar charts on here reflect some of this data. In the left-hand cluster of bars, you see some of the key indices that we refer to, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ Composite, the NASDAQ Biotechnology Index. The NBI is actually done quite well, and it's sort of held up by some really large cap companies like Amgen. But when you look at the light blue bars, which are biotech ETFs, generally focus on smaller growth companies, probably a better comparator for companies like ours. They're generally down about 40% in the year to 31st of October. It's been a terrible year for PI3K companies. And those are the green bars there. You see TG Therapeutics, Verastem, MEI Pharma. These companies down about 80 to 90% over the course of the year. And then it's actually been quite a tough year for brain cancer companies as well. Chimerix, Y-mAbs, and Kintara Therapeutics shown in the chart now, the purple bars, again on average down sort of 80 to 90%. So this has been an incredibly challenging year for all listed biotech companies, and there's not many that have been riding high in 2022. But this clearly isn't the only thing that's going on, because the reality is that Kazia has been suffering more than the companies on this slide. And so there's clearly some specific things that have been happening to our company. And I want to talk a little bit about a couple of those. So next slide, please. Now, one of the things that's happened this year, of course, has been the news we received from the GBM Agile pivotal study in August. Now, again, just as a reminder for everybody, this study was designed to seek registration for new glioblastoma drugs. It's constructed in 2 stages. So every drug that enters it recruits a first stage of up to 150 patients, and then a second stage of 50 patients. And in between the 2 stages, there is a graduation analysis. Now, the specifics of this graduation analysis are, first of all, very complicated, and second, somewhat confidential to the organization running the study. So I'm not going to go into the detailed statistics behind this analysis. But suffice to say, the bar to which drugs in the study are held is high. This is really a very, very demanding hurdle for a drug to get over. And now the positive to that is that if we had cleared that bar, I would be almost completely confident that we would be looking at an FDA approval for paxilosib. Frankly, I would be introducing you today to our new chief commercial officer, and we'd be in the business of hiring a sales force. We'd be that confident, I think, of the drug being imminently launched. We don't have quite that level of confidence today, but I think we're certainly a very long way from the flip side to that. And I think there's some reasons why we think that perhaps this non-graduation news has been overinterpreted, and outline some of these things here on the slide. So the first thing to say is, as I mentioned, the threshold to graduate to the second stage is very high. This threshold is set by the study. It's not set by FDA. And we think that the threshold for an FDA approval of a new drug in glioblastoma may be somewhat more flexible. And to give you a comparison point, the last drug that was approved for glioblastoma was Avastin. It was approved over 10 years ago. It's only approved for late-stage recurrent patients. It's only approved in a handful of countries. But that drug has never shown any survival benefit in glioblastoma. It's never shown any evidence that it prolongs the life of patients with this disease. And I think what this reflects is that a disease like this, where there are so few drugs available, remember, only one drug approved for first-line patients, only works for 1/3 of those patients. The bar is low. And so we think there's a space where a drug may not quite get the gold medal in GBM Agile, but may still be very acceptable to FDA. So one of our shareholders put in a recent conversation, if you think of this as rolling a dice, we haven't rolled a 6, which would be graduation. We haven't rolled a 1 either, because there is a futility analysis in this study. If the drug just plain doesn't work, it gets dropped. And that has not happened here. That is not the situation we find ourselves in. So there's enough reason for the study to proceed, and that's what's happened. We are still treating patients with paxilosib today. We're still monitoring these patients. So we've rolled at this stage somewhere between a 2 and a 5, and it may be that perhaps a 4 and a 5 may yet see us to an FDA registration. A couple of other things going on in the study. And I don't want to bury you in detail here, but I think it's important just to share with you, our discussions and our analysis here. The statistical power of any clinical trial, the ability of a clinical trial to pick up differences between treatments, is based partly on the number of patients in the study, but also in the period of time for which those patients have been followed. If you recruit 150 patients yesterday and you look at them today, very unlikely you're going to see a result. If you recruit 150 patients 3 years ago and you look at them today, well, if your drug's doing anything at all, the chances are you'll see it. Now, we know that GBM Agile has recruited about 4 times faster than was ever originally envisaged. And because of the COVID pandemic last year, that recruitment has probably been quite backloaded. We actually think the majority of our patients probably came in the first half of this year. So as a result, we've had a much shorter average period of observation in this study than I think was originally envisaged. And we hypothesized that the graduation analysis may therefore have occurred with much, much less statistical power than the study was designed for. Now, we can only really speculate on this. We don't have the data to confirm these things, but I think we've got a pretty reasonable guess that this is part of what's going on here. But then even putting that to one side, as you can see in the third panel on the slide, in any clinical trial, if you look too early, the curves are usually very close together. And over time, as you follow them, they separate. Now, the final analysis for GBM Agile will occur next year, and it will be fully 12 months after the final patient recruited. And an awful lot can happen to a clinical trial in 12 months. So we think this study is still got a great deal of potential to support the registration of paxilosib. We think that this has been overinterpreted, this non-graduation decision. And we think that we're going to have to wait and see what the data looks like next year. Next slide, please. So what happens when we do get that data next year? Well, look, we'll have to read it and see, but there's a number of ways this could still support us. So one possibility is that the first stage of the study, remember 150 patients on paxilosib, roughly the same number of patients again in the control group, so effectively a randomized controlled trial of about 300 patients. That could still support a full FDA approval next year. Another possibility is that FDA grants us what they call accelerated approval. So they say, look, this is pretty good and patients need new therapies. You can get out there and sell your drug, but we want you to do another clinical study in parallel. And we're very happy to do that. This is a common occurrence for cancer drugs, but we'll be selling the drug in the background. And so this would be absolutely no problem at all. There's a variant of this where they say, look, you're almost there, but we want you to do another study of, say, 50 patients just to really confirm this and lock it down. And again, I think we'd be quite happy to do that if we have to. Another possibility is they say, look, you're not quite hitting the target in the overall population, but in patients under 65 or patients with good renal function or patients who've had a total resection of their tumor, actually the drug's working really well, so we'll approve you in that group. And again, this happens all the time for cancer drugs, and that's fine because we can get out and sell it. So there's a lot of ways this could move forward, and we'll only know next year when we start seeing data, but this is not a busted flush. Next slide, please. Now, this has sort of been one event that I think has really had a lot of impact this year. But I think there's been a background anxiety as well for the company, and that's around financial position. And again, this is a complex slide, but we wanted to really share all the data with you. This is drawn entirely from our public filings on ASX, our Appendix 4C filings. And as you can see, the dark red bars here represents our expenditure R&D. The light pink sections are G&A expenditure, light blue licensing, and dark blue financing. And then the gray is sort of other things like Forex. A couple of points jump out here. First of all, just reiterate a point we've made in previous AGMs. Kazia is one of the most efficient biotech companies on ASX. We spend about 80 cents of every dollar on R&D, and that continues to be the case. Our cash burn, as you can see here, is roughly a little under 6 million Australian dollars a quarter. I hate that term cash burn, to be honest, because we don't burn a single cent in this company. We invest it in clinical trials and in research, and the payoff for that investment is the data that we present and that we've seen throughout the year. But nevertheless, we spend a little under $6 million a quarter, and that's been fairly constant for the last little while. Now, we have actually fully funded that expenditure over the last couple of quarters, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment too. But the company has been running, as a result, at a pretty flat cash balance. You see around $7 million in the first quarter, around $7 million in the second quarter, a little bit lower, down around $5.5 million, I think, in the third quarter. We actually then brought another $1.4 million US in October, so a bit of a timing mismatch there, but would be back to about 7 million after that. So we run at a kind of constant cash balance throughout the whole year of about $7 million, and we spend about a little under 6 million a quarter. Now, the trouble with that is that people look at us and they say, well, you've got about $7 million at the bank and you spend a little under $6 million a quarter. So you've got about a quarter of cash at the bank, and things are looking hairy. We've actually had about a quarter of cash at the bank all year, and we're still going strong. But this, the analysis, the simple analysis of cash divided by burn rate, really makes us look a little more fraught than I think we really are. And I think this has weighed on investor sentiment over the course of this year. Now, why have we been doing it this way, you might ask? Well, if we move to the next slide, I think one of the background realities here is that this has been an enormously challenging year for capital markets. We touched on this a few slides ago, but I just wanted to share some data here about capital markets transactions during 2022. As you can see from the left-hand panel, there has been vastly fewer transactions and very, very much less money raised in 2022 than in either 2021 or in 2020. The market for new equity raises has absolutely dried up. When you're in the US and you talk to the bankers, they used to be doing 3 or 4 transactions a week. They're now doing perhaps 2 or 3 a month, and they've already started, quite substantial downsizing on Wall Street. These transactions have been taking place at very punishing terms, as you can see in the middle panel here, for companies our size, under about $100 million, typically 20% plus discounts. And this is actually makes it look better than it really is, because most of the deals that are taking place are being led by insiders. And the few deals that are bringing in predominantly new investors, that figure's closer to 30 to 40%. And I should add that the typical transaction comes with at least 100% warrant coverage. That is to say, for every share that's issued, there's at least one accompanying call option. And as a result of these very onerous terms, the aftermarket performance you can see on the right-hand panel has not been great. And we've been very reluctant to subject our shareholders to the very dilutive kind of deals that this represents. So what have we been doing instead? Well, next slide, please. We put in place earlier this year an at-the-market financing facility on NASDAQ, which is led by Oppenheimer and Company. Now, for those who aren't familiar, an ATM facility, as they know, very common instrument. About half of NASDAQ biotech companies have them. Allows us to place shares directly into the market and raise money very economically. We sell, and we can only sell at the bid price at that moment, so there is no discount, there is no warrant coverage, and we pay about 3% fees to bankers compared to about 6 to 8% in a more conventional financing transaction. Now, there's been a lot of debate, I think, among some of our shareholders about what this does to the share price, what this means. And I would say, again, this is a pretty ubiquitous instrument. It's a bit more high profile for us because we have higher disclosure requirements under ASX than a typical NASDAQ company would do. But we're a science company, so we answer these questions with data, and this is the data. We've used the instrument 18 times over the past 6 months, so somewhere between once a week and once a fortnight, we dip into the market on average. And in general, on average, we've taken in any given month a little under 5% of the trade on NASDAQ. We obviously don't take any of the trade on ASX because the facility doesn't operate here. So less than 1 in 20 shares sold in Kazia are sold by us. The other 19 out of 20 shares are sold by other parties, by existing holders. Nothing to do with us, nothing to do with our ATM. What happens to the share price when we use it? Well, very, very difficult to make a like-for-like comparison. But in general, on the 18 days that we've used it, our share price has gone down a little bit on a volume-weighted average, but it's gone down less than it has on the days where we haven't used it. So there really isn't a clear signal here that the ATM has any kind of suppressive effect on the share price. And we've done other analysis here. We've done linear regressions and all sorts of things to really see if we can find any relationship between our participation in the market and the share price. And take it from me, there is none. But this instrument has raised 7.2 million US dollars for us, about 10 million Aussie dollars. And that money has been raised at an average of a 9.4% premium to the day's share price. So we are one of the only companies out there in our market cap band that is raising money at any kind of premium. And again, no options, no warrants, very low fees. And the average price here, I can't quite read the slide, but I think the average price is around $2.40 US on NASDAQ. It's the equivalent of about 36 cents a share in Australia, very roughly speaking. So we've succeeded in raising this money at a good price. Now, I don't want to spend too long trying to sort of justify this. I recognize that, as shareholders, nobody likes to see the company issuing any shares, and the board of the company, feels the same way. We'd rather not issue shares at all. But in a market where we have to continue to finance the company, this has been the best way to do it. Now, it's clearly not something we can continue to rely on. This is not a long-term solution. It's never really intended to be a primary source of financing for the company when we put it in place. I'm very glad we've had it as a safety net this year, but we are going to be looking at other things as we move forward. So next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I think it's just a nice segue into talking about what we do over the course of next year. And we've been spending a lot of time over the past couple of months in the boardroom and among the management team talking about how we move Kazia forward for success and how we recoup some of the withdrawal that we've had during the course of this year. And so I've listed here some of the things that we've completed from this, and you'll hear more from us over the course of the year ahead on this, because we'll be tracking ourselves to these objectives and encourage you as shareholders to do the same. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to reduce costs in the company. We spend our money on R&D, but I think we need to recognize that money is an expensive commodity at the moment. We need to ease off here. And so you will see from us a 50% cost reduction in 2023 versus 2022. That's actually beginning already in the fourth quarter, but it'll really start to hit as we head into the new year. And then now I have to peer around here to see the slides here. So we also will be investigating other sources of capital for the company. I think the ATM, as I said, has been a great safety net for us, but we don't want this to continue to be the primary source of financing for the company. So work underway to look at other ways to finance ourselves. We'll be looking, of course, at non-dilutive opportunities. So a couple of irons in the fire there. The warning I always give to shareholders is that particularly grant opportunities are slow, and you have to put in a lot of submissions to be successful. But we do have the backing of some great researchers and clinicians. We've got some very strong projects ongoing, so we think we've got a lot to play for here. we continue to diversify what we're doing beyond glioblastoma. I think one of the things we've always wanted to is make sure we're not a one-trick pony, a single bet on glioblastoma. And I think I'm very glad that we have the work that's ongoing childhood brain cancer and brain mets, and you'll see a lot more focus from us on those things as we move into 2023. And I think one of the things we're also very sensitive to is that because of the way we do our clinical trials, because we're more than usually reliant on the clinicians we work with, we're a little bit at their mercy in terms of data readouts. And that unfortunately goes with the territory, but we'll be working really hard to try and lock these guys down to very, very clear timetables for data in 2023. My colleague, Dr. John Friend, our Chief Medical Officer, is actually in Florida right now, meeting with most of our investigators at the Society for Neuro-Oncology annual meeting. And one of the things he's really going to be doing is saying, when are you going to have data for us? Let's make sure we make this very crystalline. And then last few things here is, as you can see, one of the key things I really want to single out, the last thing at the bottom, is we need to get out there and talk more to investors and to our shareholders. I think the timely thing is that with all the restrictions associated with the pandemic lifting, it's a lot easier for us to get out and speak to people. And we clearly need to get out there and remind people what we're doing, remind people of the enormous potential and promise inherent in both of our molecules, and thereby, I think, to start rebuilding the value of the company. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop there, and I'd be very happy at this point to take your questions. So, thank you. Thank you. So the question was around Paxaloside in China. Obviously, we had hoped to include China in the GBM Agile study. Now that it's effectively fully recruited, that won't be happening. We're in discussion with our partner, Simcere, there. As most people in the room will be aware, we partnered last year with Simcere Pharmaceutical to commercialize in China. And to some extent, this is going to be their call. Probably wait until next year when we sort of see data, and then ultimately the Chinese regulatory environment will require a standalone registration study in China. So we're already talking a little bit about what that will look like. So, so this may slow us down by 6 months or so in China, but it's not unusual for drugs to end up having to do a standalone study in China.
So, the GBM Agile adaptive study is supposed to be designed as a flexible study that can move up and doing more traditional techniques.
Yeah.
Is there any scope for going back into GBM Agile, given that it's used to have potency in combination with, ONC201?
Sure.
Is there any ability to go back, given that there's 150 that are sitting on cells as we see here now? Is there any scope to go back into GBM Agile?
Yeah.
Think that back into GBM Agile, given that the drug hasn't been pulled up.
Yeah. Yeah, Steve, thank you. And so the question again, just for those online, was whether there's any opportunity to re-enter GBM Agile. Look, I think the first thing says we probably won't need to. I think we're still expecting that when we see data next year, at the very least, it should give us a clear answer for Paxaloside as a monotherapy. So it's going to fundamentally either tell us the drug works or it doesn't. That's our expectation. GBM Agile is purely a glioblastoma study, so we wouldn't look to that study to explore the drug and say brain metastases or childhood brain cancer. That's just not what it's designed to do. It's purely glioblastoma. The one scenario where we could conceivably consider re-entering it would be if we had, say, combination data in glioblastoma. And we do have a study ongoing with ketogenesis and hypoinsulinemia, which we haven't really spoken about today because we'll have more to say about it next year. If that data came out next year and looked stellar, we could look to become a new arm in GBM Agile there. Look, if you'd asked me that question, Steve, in August, I would have said, sure, when hell freezes over, we'll go back to one of these studies. I think that would be unduly harsh. I think we have to be open-minded here. I think let's wait and see the final results before we decide whether we do another one of these academic-led studies or whether we try and do this more ourselves. Mark. Yeah, Mark, no, it's a great question. So again, the question was, why has this been such a bad year for PI3K companies and brain cancer companies? Brain cancer, it's fair to say, is an unloved disease area. And the simple reality is it's been failure prone. A lot of people have tried. There's been a lot of cancer vaccine approaches. There's been immunotherapy approaches, even people trying to do things like CAR T and brain cancer. And it's so far, it's all tanked. And so investors are wary, and in a market where people are very risk off, as the analyst says, a market where people are very, very resistant to these, sort of more complex stories, disease areas like brain cancer are often the first to suffer. So I think that's what's going on there. In the PI3K class, there's something a bit more specific that's been happening. There have been 5 drugs approved by FDA in the PI3K class. Now, 4 of those are approved for blood cancers, and they were approved on relatively thin data at the time. And FDA, over the course of this year in particular, has been coming out and saying, well, actually, we have concerns now about the long-term safety of some of these drugs, and we think maybe the data that was used to prove them was a bit too thin. So 2 things have happened. FDA has said for any future PI3K inhibitor approvals in blood cancer, they want to see randomized controlled trials with survival endpoints. And the second thing is that because of this new requirement, at least 2 of the drugs in the class, well, one of them has been withdrawn from the market, Kazia Therapeutics umbralisib, and I think one of them's in the firing line. I think it's still hanging on by its fingernails, but duvelisib, Copictra from Secura Bio. So I think this has put a cloud over the PI3K inhibitor class. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, look, short answer is it means nothing for us. We already have a randomized controlled trial with a survival endpoint in GBM Agile. So we are already providing the kind of data that FDA has said they want to see, and then some. Second, we're in a disease that's very, very different from lymphoma and CLL, the diseases that these drugs have been targeting. The kinds of diseases we're treating do not have other treatment options. Lymphoma is actually quite busy at the moment. There's a lot of new therapies that have been coming on, a lot of new treatments. FDA can set the bar quite high, but for brain cancer, it's the exact opposite. There is nothing. It's a desert. And so I think the agency is likely to be a little bit more open-minded to drugs in this disease area. And then finally, in the 350 patients or so of clinical experience in paxilosib, we have not been seeing any of these safety concerns with our drug. We haven't been seeing any evidence of liver toxicity, any GI perforations. We haven't been seeing, really any significant amount of febrile neutropenia, and any of these things that have been scary with some of these older drugs in the class. We think we actually have potentially a best-in-class safety profile here with paxilosib, but this has certainly been a much less scary development program than some of these older drugs. So we don't think it matters for us, but sentiment is against PI3K at the moment. I don't think it makes a difference, to be honest. I think we're in such a different disease area that I don't think there's going to be any sort of crosstalk, if you like. And I think if we were targeting blood cancers, then I'd be a little more nervous. And there are some companies that are doing it. So one of the companies on the slide there, MEI Pharma, has had a PI3K inhibitor, are developing for blood cancers, and that's why their share price is down, I think, 89%. But we've taken a very, very different direction with our drug. We've deliberately stayed away from those kind of indications. Steve.
James, can you talk on the dual listing? Like, when it was originally set up, there were obvious clear benefits to being in the US market, access to capital, shareholder base, good lead into the US marketplace with drug companies, FDA, all over there. So that was the reasoning, obviously, clear reason. It's unclear to me now, and I have a personal opinion that I think the US share price is still absolutely still, and it's occurred not once, but on multiple occasions this year. The company has released good information, good trial data, advanced approvals, whatever it happens to be. The first time it happened, I thought it was an anomaly. I now have a personal opinion that it's occurred that many times, and the behaviour is exactly the same. An announcement comes out, on the surface of it, it looks terrific, very positive, the drug, all good news. I'm putting GD and Agile on one side. I'm just talking about over the 12-month period. There have been a number of announcements. And if you sit up and you watch the stock trade in the US, it's identical. The behaviour is identical. The share price ramps up 20, 30, 40%. You go to bed and you think, thank God. Finally, some momentum coming back into the stock price. People recognising it's more good news. You've been up at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. Not only is it given up all the time, it's finished down 20-25%. The tail then wags the dog. The ASX wakes up in the morning and goes, oh my God, it's going to happen overnight in the US. And then the tail wags the dog and it's Canada. My first opinion is there a question? Is the company going to go to the ASX? It's involved shorting. Shorting is rampant in the US. And there have been a number of situations, where companies can be driven by this great Amoeba that's out there. They all pile on, they're all on these chapters, whatever, and they stop and they just smash the GP back. And they can run it completely backwards. So you get a multi-hyper scenario where stock runs up on good news and finishes. Not back where it started. 25% back from where it started. It's more logical. Sorry to go on about it. But I think it's important because it's really, now we're in this situation in the US where we're below $1. It's always knuckleheads on the paper going 18 days till we get a deficiency notice, 16 days, 7 days. They're on a countdown. And they continue to just push the stock down. So their best interest is to see that go to zero. Their best financially is to run the stock. So is there anything the company can do to circle the wagons or at least go back to the SEC? Things like, can we go on a non-shorting story or something? We go to the SEC and go, we believe this is not accidental, we believe it's not trivial, and it has a monumental effect on the company. So what can be done?
Steve, thank you. And look, I'll try and just summarize that very briefly for those online. So the question was really around just some of the response of the stock to news in the US, and particularly this phenomenon where you sometimes get a really good start on the day and then it tails off. And the question was around, is there shorting going on and so on? Look, so first thing to say is this isn't actually completely unusual. I saw some analyst research out of Morgan Stanley in roughly the middle of the year, and they went through all the news releases from NASDAQ-listed biotech companies. And they looked at what happens when a company releases news, and they found that if the news was negative, on average, the company's share price declined by 50% on the day, which is horrendous, but no great surprise. And of course, that's what happened to us on the 1st of August when we came out with this GBM Agile news. So it rings true. But interestingly, they found that when a company releases positive news, their share price declines by 10% on the day. So, it's a bit of a catch-22. The conclusion maybe the best thing is just to keep quiet. So we're probably not the only company that sees a little bit of this. Now, we've asked the question as well, what on earth is going on? Now, we don't think that short selling is any very significant contributor to this. It's just not an awful lot of stock to borrow, frankly. Most of our stock is in retail hands. It doesn't get lent out for shorting. And frankly, we're a lousy candidate for shorting because when you short a stock, you want to be pretty confident it's going to go down and you want liquidity. Where you want a stock that's overvalued and liquid. We're undervalued and relatively illiquid. So biotech in particular is one of these industries where one good readout can double or treble the share price in a day, and that can be very unfortunate if you've got a big short position. So the only data source we can look to is NASDAQ itself. They do provide data on stocks available for shorting. When we look at Kazia there, we show up with an absolutely tiny short interest. It's next to nothing. Now, whether that's the whole story or not, I can't tell you, but on all available information, we really can't identify it. We have spoken to a number of analysts and advisors and bankers and said, what is this strange profile? I'm glad to hear, by the way, I'm not the only person that stays up to 1 or 2 in the morning watching the share price. Makes me feel a little bit less lonely when I'm watching the NASDAQ open. But one suggestion that's been put to us, and I'm not nearly enough of a financier to really know if this rings true, but the suggestion is the stock has attracted the interest of day traders. They see press releases go out, they buy the stock without even necessarily reading it. They just wait to see if it doubles in price, and if it doesn't, they sell out and move on. We get this churn, and that certainly again rings true because we see a lot of the volume in the morning. We see this burst of activity, and it tails off in the afternoon. Whatever the explanation is, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot we can honestly do about it, except just to get out there and tell the story. I think the reality is the share market is often imbalanced in the short term. I do kind of believe it generally gets it right in the medium to long term. I think we just have to focus on the long game and maybe not be too distracted by these kind of day-to-day ups and downs, because I think that is the thing that whatever is going on will clear it out, is really being able to demonstrate that long-term trajectory. I'm conscious of time, but I just want to address another point that Steve touched on, and we may have time for just one or two questions from online. But the other question that was sort of wrapped up there is around NASDAQ, around our bid price, which, as you say, is under $1. And for those that are familiar with NASDAQ, be aware that there is a requirement on NASDAQ to maintain a minimum bid price of $1. We are currently trading under that threshold. And if we trade under that threshold for 30 consecutive trading days, we will receive a NASDAQ deficiency notice. And we do expect to receive that at some point in the next few weeks. Now, the consequences of this are limited in the short term. We have a 6-month cure period to get our share price above $1. And we can then ask for an extension to get this, which essentially gets us another 6 months. So, practical purposes, we likely have 12 months to get ourselves back above $1 before there is any possibility of delisting from NASDAQ. And sad to say, with the market being where it is, we are not the only company in this position. In fact, several of the companies on one of my slides there have also recently received NASDAQ deficiency notices. There's a lot of this about. It's unwelcome, I won't deny. It's be frustrating and annoying, but it has no real near-term implications for business. As I say, we've got 12 months to fix it, and I'm extremely optimistic the share price will be back over $1 in that period. I want to make sure we don't shortchange those online. So if we have another minute or two, perhaps we can just address a couple of the questions that have been coming through from online, just to make sure we do justice to everybody.
James, you've covered one of the questions that's come from online, but another one looking into quite different areas. You mentioned the company will be reducing by 50%. You haven't spoken much about EVT 801 today. Is the company trying to?
Thanks, Kate. And again, the question for anybody online who didn't hear, is the company thinking about suspending any of the activity around EVT-801, our second drug to conserve cash? Look, ideally not. I think we haven't really spoken much about it today just because of where this drug is and its development, but we're actually also really excited about EVT-801. We think it genuinely has huge potential. We wouldn't have brought it in if we didn't feel that way. So I think it'd be very reluctant to shortchange EVT-801 at this stage. What we might look at doing is just altering the sequencing of events a little bit over the course of next year. We might move a few things around, we might bring some things forward, push other things back, and just change the sequence of things a little bit, partly to phase our cash expenditure a little bit better over the course of next year. And I think that could give us some savings in 2023, and partly also to try and drive that to data that we can then take out to investors as early as possible. I think we want to be able to talk to investors about the potential we see in that drug, and so the earlier we've got good credible data, the better. So we are looking at some ways to tinker with it. We may adjust it a little bit, but I think it would be a terrible shame if we stopped working on it, and that's not our plan at this stage. Mark.
My memory serves me correctly. I think the company was running on to phase 2.
Correct. Yeah.
If we got a sort of a middle of the road type result from the
Yep.
Can we sort of then seeing the two what sort of data together? Would that be something that
Yeah, Mark, it's a good question. So again, for those online, the question was around the company's own phase 2 study of paxilosib in glioblastoma, and whether if we had a more equivocal result out of GBM Agile, whether we can sort of pool the two together. Now, to some extent, that always happens. So FDA will always examine the totality of the evidence for a drug, not just the pivotal clinical study, but all the other work that's going on, the aggregate safety data, even the preclinical data. So they do take a very, very broad-ranging look at things. Our phase 2 study was not designed to support registration. And it's a relatively smaller study, about 30 patients. So there's probably a limited sense to which it would directly outweigh a negative result in GBM Agile if that ended up being the result next year. However, it certainly would help us to interpret that data. I think we would look at it closely, and if we did get a different result between the two studies, I think we'd look very closely to understand why. And just as a reminder, that study reported overall survival of 15.7 months. The comparison point there for the existing standard of care, 12.7 months. The data was presented this year at ASCO, at ESMO, the European Society of Medical Oncology, and it is being presented this week at the Society for Neuro-Oncology meeting in Tampa, Florida. So it gives you a sense that this data has been subject of high interest. So Mark, it all feeds in. It's all grist to the mill. Very difficult at this stage to know quite what role it's going to play in the overall picture. But look, it's going to be an input, but perhaps not a casting vote.
Okay, James.
I think we are now at the stage where you've done enough. There's going to be more questions as we go through the formal business, I'm sure. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so moving to the more formal business of the meeting, the minutes of the previous annual general meeting of members of the company, which was the annual general meeting held on the 10th of November 2021, were approved by the board and signed by myself as chair of that general meeting in accordance with the provisions of Section 251A of the Corporations Act. The original minutes are tabled, and there are copies of those minutes available for inspection. The notice of meeting has been given in accordance with the company's constitution, and I'm going to take it that the notice of meeting has been read. Proxies, the company secretary, Kate Hill, will advise us to the proxies received.
Mr. Chairman, we've received proxies representing around 60 million votes, which represents about 37% of the issued share capital of the company, and the proxy position is shown on the slide.
Okay, and I now have to read my formal chairman's address, which was loaded to the ASX platform this morning before the start of the meeting. So I will rattle through that, as I hope you've all read it already. And also it actually backs up a number of things that James has been presenting. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the board of directors, welcome to the 2022 annual general meeting for Kazia Therapeutics. I'm grateful that we are actually able to return to a live format this year and to have the opportunity to reconnect with shareholders in person. I'll say from the outset that the past year has been one of the most challenging, not only for our industry, but particularly for Kazia. We've seen a rapid and very substantial contraction of equity investment in life sciences, which has greatly depressed valuations across the sector, and the few financing tractions that have occurred have generally taken place on extremely arduous terms, with the majority of companies having to rely on upon the support of existing shareholders to see them through this period of turbulence. Against this backcloth of turbulence, Kazia has had to deal with a number of additional challenges, none more than the untimely but mandatory disclosure by the company of an ambiguous update on the GBM Agile trial, which led to an immediate 50% one-day fall in the share price. In addition, the company has had to be overly reliant on its ATM facility for funding, which has been a point of concern for some shareholders. We recognize the need to restore this instrument to its intended place, an occasional tool to strengthen the balance sheet opportunistically, but not a primary source of funding. Nevertheless, the notion that a company with two high-quality clinical stage assets, boasting a wealth of positive data from almost a dozen clinical trials, could trade at a market cap of less than 20 million Australian dollars would have been unthinkable 18 months ago. As a shareholder myself, I can fully appreciate the extent to which this situation tests the nerves of members. The complex technical progress of drug development is difficult, whereas the day-to-day movements of share price are readily visible and appear straightforward. It is easy for short-term fluctuations in the latter to eclipse the underlying bedrock of scientific achievement and commercial opportunity. Let me take this opportunity just to restate the fundamentals of our company. We have two world-class oncology drugs in our pipeline. They were invented by two of the most successful companies in the industry and entrusted to us on competitive commercial terms because they believed this team was judged to know how to develop them. We've gone on to initiate 11 clinical trials at some of the premier cancer research centers in the world with the collaboration of some of the leading global experts in the field. So compelling is the science that many of these institutions have made substantial in-kind and even financial contributions to the work, and we have benefited from many millions of dollars of competitive grant funding. This year alone, we've presented 10 data readouts at international scientific conferences. Every one of these data readouts has been positive, and several have been little short of remarkable. The US FDA has awarded us 2 special designations to our lead program, Paxilosib. And as of today, we're managing clinical research activity across 9 clinical trials in 8 countries, with a team comprising just 8 full-time employees. Approximately 80 cents out of every dollar that we spend is invested in progressing this pipeline. The news that Paxilosib would not graduate to the second stage of the GBM Agile trial in August was an unwelcome surprise. And I will not reiterate here the reasons why we believe this event may have lesser implications than the market has assumed. I'll simply point out that the study remains ongoing, with all patients continuing on Paxilosib or in follow-up according to the protocol. The Paxilosib arm has been declared futile, not been declared futile, nor has it been terminated due to any concerns over safety. We're completely blinded to the data, which continues to mature on a daily basis as patients proceed through this study, and we expect to see first and final data from the study in the second half of 2023. And there's every chance that the data will support a marketing authorization for Paxilosib in glioblastoma. Regardless of the eventual outcome of the GBM Agile trial, there are many other ways for us to win with Paxilosib. Over the past several years, we've carefully deployed a broad clinical trial program, partly to expand the field of opportunity for the drug and partly to hedge against risks such as this. That work is already paying off with stellar data in brain metastases and growing excitement around childhood brain cancer, emerging as just 2 of the most promising paths forward for Paxilosib. I would argue, therefore, that movements in the share price this year do not reflect any part of the underlying reality of the company. At times, share prices are driven more by abstract sentiment than by any objective consideration of the science and economics. The primary tasks for this board and management of Kazia as we head into 2023 are to reconnect the company with the investors, to reaffirm the enormous value of our pipeline, and to restore some sensible valuation to our stock. Those tasks are summarized in the plan that has been described by the CEO, and work is already underway. I'm actually entirely confident that by executing it carefully and patiently on our plans, we will return this company to its rightful standing. Kazia has been through difficult times before, but I can assure you that we have the experience, the commitment, and the resolve to see the job through. Quite simply, there's too much at stake to do otherwise. I'll conclude by once again thanking my fellow directors, our CEO, Dr. James Garner, and his management team for their hard work through the year. Despite this challenging backdrop, it's actually a testament that both to the value of our pipeline and the professionalism of our team, that actually the sentiment within Kazia remains entirely positive and forward-looking. Finally, I wish to thank the shareholders for your continuing support of the company. It's not been the easiest 12 months to be an investor in Kazia. However, you remain invested in a company with enormous potential, and your board will leave no stone unturned to ensure that this potential is realized and recognized. So before we address the resolutions, I'm going to have to make a few comments on voting procedure, which will be adopted today. Voting will be conducted by way of a poll on all items of business. In order to provide you with enough time to vote, I'll shortly open voting for all resolutions. At that time, if you're eligible to vote at this meeting, a new voting tab will appear. Selecting this tab will bring up a list of resolutions and present you with voting options. To cast your vote, simply select one of the options. There is no need to hit a submit or enter button, as your vote will automatically be recorded. You do, however, have the ability to change your vote up until then, the time that I declare the voting closed. I now declare voting open on all items of business. The voting tab will soon appear. Please submit your votes at any time, and I will give you a warning before I move to closing it. Financial statements and reports for the year ended 30th of June 2022. I'll take the financial report, director's report, and auditor's report as read and received. I will be pleased to answer any questions from the floor relating to the financial report, director's report, and auditor's report. I remind you, only shareholders are able to ask questions. If necessary, I may also call on my fellow directors or company executives to comment on particular questions or matters in relation to the annual report. Are there any questions on the financial report? In the room? Online? Okay, thank you. That concludes our consideration of the financial statement reports. I will now explain the procedure for the remainder of the meeting. The following items of business require a formal vote, and all resolutions will be decided via poll. I appoint Paul Latinsky of Computershare Investor Services as a returning officer. The poll is now open, and you may register your vote any time during this formal part of the meeting. At the end of polling process, I will formally close the poll and then close the meeting. Paul and his team will collate the results of the poll, which will be announced to the ASX and posted on our website as soon as they're available. Moving now to the next item of the notice of meeting, our first resolution concerns the adoption of the remuneration report. This requires an ordinary resolution and is non-binding. Resolution 1, the remuneration report. To consider and, if thought fit, to pass the following as an ordinary resolution. That for the purposes of Section 250R (2) of the Corporations Act, and for all other purposes, the remuneration report for the year ended 30th of June 2022, as set out in the annual report for the year ended 30th of June 2022, be adopted on the terms and conditions set in the explanatory statement. Now, the slide shows, and I'm going to speak off turn here, out of turn, the slide shows the proxy votes. And as an investor, I can see that this was not going to reach the level required. And I would just say to you that I'm really disappointed that after this meeting, the only thing that will be reported in the press is that the remuneration report went down. And yet again, people will be talking about things that really aren't important. They won't be talking about our science, and they won't be talking about all these data that we've actually produced. But that is understandable, I think, under the circumstances. And there's a largest abstention vote, and we take it on the chin. And I just want you to know, as chairman, we are going to review that, and we will listen to what the shareholders are saying. But I think it is a great shame because there are 8 people here doing their damnedest to make this company successful. So I'll move that the remuneration report and the annual report be adopted. Are there any questions that anybody would like to ask us? Anything online? No. In the room? I'll now, Mark.
Have the directors considered taking a haircut on some of the remuneration that we take in the short term?
Yes.
Part of the cost cutting.
Yes. We're considering everything at the moment. What we are considering is we are going to have to take a hit, all of us, which includes some of the people who we've employed in the last year, which is interesting because we have to incentivize and we have to have the quality of people to run this business. But the answer to your question, Mark, is everybody is actually most likely going to take a hit. Okay, so I move the remuneration report and the annual report adopted. We've done the questions. I'll now put the resolution to the vote. Please now register your vote. The next item is a little bit more enjoyable and set out in the notice meeting. Sorry?
This is for the online only, mate.
On your voting card.
On your voting card.
Oh, and we're not doing it.
No. Because we want to make sure everybody votes. Okay. I know some people that like to do it just in the room and they sneak things through. We've decided we're taking everything. The next item is set out in the notice of meeting relates to the re-election of Steve Coffey as a director. Now, brief biological data and Steve is set out in the explanatory notes to the notice of meeting. No other nominations have been received in accordance with the company's constitution. The resolution as follows: the re-election of Mr. Stephen Coffey as a director, to consider and if thought fit to pass the following resolution as an ordinary resolution, that for the purposes of listing rule 14.4 and clauses 21.1 and 21.7 of the constitution, Stephen Coffey, who retires by rotation and being eligible, is re-elected as a director. Next slide shows the proxy votes. So I move that Mr. Coffey be re-elected as director of the company. Are there any questions? Would you like him to give a 20-minute presentation on his background? No. Okay. I'll put the resolution to the vote. Please register your vote and mark up your cards in here. The next item is set out in the notice of meeting related to the grant of options to Dr. James Garner. You'll be aware that the directors have withdrawn this resolution prior to the meeting. So we'll move on to resolution 4, with the chairman just saying, it is a great shame that the person that's leading this company now no longer has any equity incentive apart from the shares that he continues to buy. But you have expressed your views and we will take them on board. So the next item is set out in the notice of meeting relates to the ratification of the prior issue of shares. The background to this resolution is set out in the explanatory notes to the notice of meeting, and the resolution is as follows. Ratification of prior shares of ATM shares. To consider, if thought fit, to pass, prior issue of ATM shares, to consider and if thought fit to pass the following resolution as an ordinary resolution, that for the purposes of listing rule 7.4 and for all other purposes, shareholders ratify the prior allotment and issue of 17,160,230 ATM shares on the terms and conditions set out in the explanatory statement. The next slide shows the proxy votes received in relation to this resolution, and I move that the prior issue of ATM shares be ratified. Are there any questions in the room or online? Okay, I'll now put the resolution to vote. Please register your vote. The next item, as set out in the notice of meeting, relates to the approval of additional placement capacity. The background to this resolution is set out in the explanatory notes to the notice of meeting. The resolution is as follows. Approval of additional placement capacity under listing rule 7.1a, to consider and if thought fit to pass the following resolution as a special resolution, that for the purposes of Listing Rule 7.1A and for all other purposes, shareholders approve the additional capacity of the company to issue equity securities up to 10% of the issued capital of the company at the time of issue, calculated in accordance with the formula prescribed in Listing Rule 7.1A2 and on the terms and conditions set out in the explanatory statement. Next slide shows the proxy votes received in relation to that resolution. I move that the additional placement capacity be approved. Are there any questions? I put the resolution to the vote. Please now register your vote. The next two items are set out in the notice of meeting relate to updates to the company's constitution. The background to this resolution is set out in the explanatory notes to the notice of meeting. The resolution is as follows. Resolution 6, adoption of a new constitution. To consider and if thought fit to pass the following resolution as a special resolution. That for the purposes of Section 136 of the Corporations Act and for all other purposes, the current constitution of the company be repealed and the new constitution of the form as signed by the chair for identification purposes, excluding clause 14, be adopted as the new constitution of the company. The next slide shows proxy votes received in relation to this. I move that the new constitution be approved. Are there any questions on this? I'm really excited you wanted to explain it. I'll now put the resolution to the vote. Please register your vote. Our final item of formal business today also concerns the company's constitution. Resolution 7 is approval of proportional takeover provisions. To consider and if thought fit to pass the following resolution as a special resolution. That for the purposes of sections 136 and 64(8)(g) of the Corporations Act and for all other purposes, the proportional takeover provisions contained in Schedule 2 to the explanatory memorandum be inserted as clause 14 into the new constitution approved under Resolution 6, and that the next slide shows the proxy votes received in relation to this resolution. I move that the appropriate clause be inserted into the new constitution. Are there any questions on this?
Yeah, just in layman's terms, can you talk about what this?
She's been dreaming of this.
Just in terms of
Yeah.
why do we need this? And
Yeah.
what's the background behind it?
Yeah, so it's first of all, it's quite a common clause for companies to put in their constitution. So essentially, if you don't have this clause, somebody could offer everybody to take, essentially, if you don't have this clause, then if a bidder offered to take over 60% of everybody's shareholding, and if they gained acceptance from shareholders, essentially a bidder could own the majority of the shares, everyone else could own a small number, and obviously they would be disadvantaged. So essentially these provisions mean that if a proportional bid is made, the shareholders actually vote on whether to go ahead with that proportional takeover. So essentially it's a protection for shareholders against some kind of gaining of control by stealth. And I got a nod from the lawyer.
And it has to be renewed every 3 years.
And
Yes.
thank you. Yeah, it has to be
Lasts
renewed
for
every 3 years.
Under
Yep.
the law, so it has to be refreshed by shareholders.
Yeah. So it's actually shareholder protection.
Okay, I'll put that resolution to the vote. Please register your vote. So that's the end of the resolutions. Please ensure that you've registered your vote for each resolution. I'm going to wait a couple of moments before closing the poll to ensure that you've all had time to register your votes. And then Paul and his team can collect the voting cards from the attendees in the room. And if there are any remaining questions, then we can also deal with these now. Oh. Want to ask something, Steve?
Can I just make a comment? Back to the options for James.
Yep.
specifically, and then more about directors' fees and stuff. Given the external focus on the company, would there not be merit to be seen that, if the directors could say a reduced dollar amount that invested, and I recognise that directors have all, particularly James, have bought on numerous occasions at market prices. I'm aware you guys paid $1.40 a share as did the rest of us not more than 12 months ago. So I understand a little more about potentially from the public view of the company in terms of the board's continued faith in the business and there's so much good stuff going on and whatever. do you think there's merit in putting some sort of external statement forward that?
Yeah, to be honest with you, Steve, I'm the one obstacle to that at the moment because I'm paying on my own dollar to come here and do the job. And actually, it makes not a tittle of a difference to the overall cash burn of the company. What makes a difference is what we do on the big things. So the question about, EVT 801 was really appropriate. How can we actually change that, still continue to do it, and make sure that we extend the cash runway? The other thing is, I think the directors are going to have to work their backsides off to try and convince people, as James said, get out and spend more time with investors, spend more time. I chair a company on NASDAQ. So when I go to the States, I actually meet James, and for nothing, I work with James. So yeah, if it makes a big difference, I'm happy to take a hit, but I actually don't think that's the issue in this company. What I think is about finding ways to get real amounts of money in to actually allow us to progress going forward. So as I mentioned, I chair a company on NASDAQ, which I went back to in April 2019. By the way, the share price has gone up tenfold, but we were running it on a shoestring until last year. We delisted in London, we stayed on NASDAQ, and we raised a lot of money because we spent a lot of shoe leather talking to investors. And so I think that's what we've got to do. I think, Bryce is extremely well connected, both here in the United States. I'm connected in both areas, also in Europe. And James does spend a lot of shoe leather. But if it makes people happy, yes, we'll put out a statement and say that the directors are taking a hit. But that's.
I think what you're saying is have a
I think
dollars and shares.
The sentiment of my comment.
Yeah.
It goes back to options for James. I think a lot of people were viewing that 26, and the irony of it was when the step point was put at 26 cents, the shares were at 18. So the initial reaction was, oh, great, we're all 70%, 80% underwater. But as soon as it pops 10 or 15%, then. And so the comment that I made was certainly supportive of options for James, but would have preferred to see them at a further step.
Yeah, and I think that's a valid comment, and certainly.
So that was more a sentiment about not punishing anyone, but in fact being party to rewarding people for effort. I have no issue with that philosophically. I guess it was more at the steps that they were.
Well, I think that's right, and I think we as a board took it on board. We were shocked. And I suppose one of the things that we're very keen to do is to make sure that our management team, our key management team, are incentivized. But maybe we have to look at how we do that. And it was very clear to me and the other directors that James's options were not going to get approved. And, as far as I'm concerned, it's a bit of a kick in the teeth to him. But I'd rather not put it through a formal resolution and say it got voted down. It was withdrawn by the board. And yes, we noticed there's a huge abstention vote in terms of remuneration. So that means we have to sit down and look at how we operate. And I think as part of our cost cutting, which we are looking at, obviously we've saved a lot because we're not having to pay into GBM Agile anymore. I think we're going to look at how we incentivize the team. But, we have during the year taken on 2 absolutely excellent executives in the United States. And we need to keep them because, managing this is not easy with only 8 people. And so I overreact because I'm actually very hacked off that we're all talking about remuneration when we should be talking about 7 out of 8.
I think as shareholders, we would all love to see an announcement come out that says one of the big farmers has tipped in 20 million and taken a 10%. That's what we're all looking for.
And that's what we're all trying to do.
So the sentiment here is not about punching the board or making people feel bad. We all feel bad about what's occurred over the last 18 months. It's catastrophic. If we were all in this room in October 2021 and said, let's do a straw poll, what do we think the share price will be in 12 months? It was sitting around about $1.40. I don't think anyone in this room would have said, I reckon less than 10 cents dropping. But you would have been marched to the door as it's not being good. So we're feeling I think we're all in the same boat. So I don't think.
But I think you'll find that. The point you've made about us investing. I'm a Scotsman. I ain't going to miss an offer at 10 cents. Of course I'm not. because actually I believe in the company. So that's where I would actually put my focus. And, we've already discussed, will it be seen as a negative or a positive to invest? People, if you don't invest as a director, you always fail. You never invest enough. Even if you invest 50,000, somebody says, oh, it should have been 100. But I think you'll find that we'll be investing, which I think is a better way of demonstrating our commitment.
And that's the sentiment, I guess,
Yeah.
the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just on the investing though, if you buy shares on the market, they're just getting recycled. Would you consider some sort of share issue plan or something like that? Because that's bringing new capital. Because from an outsider's point of view as a shareholder, biggest risk to me is the company doesn't have the cash to keep going.
You're absolutely right, Mark.
And it doesn't matter if you've got the best widget in the world,
Yeah.
if you can't get it on the market.
So I think the answer to that is we're a public company and we're looking at every way of, funding this company. And obviously we can't say any more than that, but I can say categorically, if anything happened in the next 12 months and we brought in big money or we raised money, we would be including the shareholders in that as well, the opportunity. And we did that before.
Can you elaborate more on where you think you're going to find the 50% savings if it's not cutting the EVT 801?
Yeah, well, I think we literally last week went through a line by line. We're looking at a number of things. The advisors are all squeezing a bit now. You can see them getting a bit irritated. Yeah, I mean, we have to cut our cloth. And I mean, James very kindly said, in Kazia, we've been through this in 2018 to 20. I can assure you, when I joined the company in 2015, or actually, the second time in 2015, we were in the same place. So we will have to make cuts. We will all have to take a bit of a hit personally. But I think I would rather not be specific at the moment. But as I think James has alluded to, we intend to keep our programs going. That is the priority. Yeah. So there are other things that we do, in terms of maybe PR, IR, media, things that we pay out routinely that we would just actually have to ask some of our advisors to take a hit. So, yeah. But remember, portion of that 50% has to be seen that we're no longer investing in GB and Agile. I'm not going to give you any more than that because we haven't agreed it yet, have we?
Can you just talk on a positive note about government? We're running trials in Australia now, for example. Where does that place us to government grants or a little bit more focus on R&D credits and just grant money in general?
Do you want to comment?
Sure.
I can speak to that point a little bit. And again, for those online, the question was around access to R&D incentives here in Australia, grants and R&D rebates, things like that. So the good news is we are now running Paxalosib clinical work in Australia. It's actually the first time we've done clinical trials here in Australia with that drug. And we've got 2 sites right now recruiting to the DRPG study. I won't say the bad news, but the counterpoint to that is we're not actually paying any money for that study. It's entirely externally funded. It's funded through a combination of the organizations running it, the Pacific Pediatric Neuro-Oncology Consortium based out of UCSF in California, and a number of grants and so on. And so we just don't have a lot of expenditure to claim the R&D rebate against. Now, we probably can realize some rebates next year on things like our internal expenses, our shipping costs, things like that. Don't think it's going to be a huge amount of money, but if there's 1 cent there, my colleague Gabrielle Heaton sitting in the front row, she's very, very good at squeezing money out of people, and if there's $1 to be had, she'll find it. So we'll be looking at that for next year. There are other sources of grant funding here in Australia, the Medical Research Future Fund, things like that, and we continue to look at those. I'll be very honest and say that it's quite difficult to access them as a private company. It's Australia's grant funding regime is if I can put it this way, it's where it's where the United States was 30 or 40 years ago. Very, very much focused on academia and really kind of ignores the role of private enterprise in commercializing work. And that can make it tough for a company like ours as publicly listed. We've generally found better success in the United States. Even there, all the grant funding that we benefit from has been collaborative. It's been through other parties. And we'll continue to keep trying in both jurisdictions.
But I think the last thing I'd say, Steve, is that certainly since I've been down here for the last 2 weeks, I've visited a lot of institutions and generally just making contacts with people. But Kazia is featured in every single discussion because nobody can believe, how undervalued it is. So it's about closing on these people. So I'm actually, after the last 2 or 3 weeks, very confident that we've got a great story. Anybody want to make any comments here? Nope.
Can I ask one final thing?
Yes.
James, you mentioned that Matt Dunn's doing a presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So again, the question was around Matt Dunn's presentation at the Society for Neuro-Oncology annual meeting, which is taking place later this week. And just for background, for anybody who's not familiar, Matt has been working for some years now on paxiloside in DIPG, stroke DMG, this rare childhood brain cancer. He's shown great evidence that our drug works by itself. He's shown incredible evidence for a combination of paxiloside and ONC201, a drug manufactured by a company in the US. And that's going to be the thrust of his presentation at SNO. Now, I'll say right up front, I don't know exactly the full detail of what he's presenting. I do anticipate that this will be somewhat incremental data. This will be building on a story that he's been telling throughout the year. He presented some of this at a conference called ISPNO back in June, and we actually had a webinar with him, which I'd recommend people look up on the website. So I think this will just continue to build that story. It'll flesh out the detail. It is quite science-heavy research because this is lab research. So I think it's going to be perhaps of more interest to the researchers and the clinicians than to investors at this stage. But I think as this story builds, it gives us another really powerful piece of ammunition to put in front of professional investors over the course of 2023. I'd just say briefly, there's people say, gosh, brain cancer is tough enough. Pediatric brain cancer, are you guys really going to hang your hat on this? Company in the US, Day One Biopharmaceuticals, they are really just a pediatric brain cancer story, and that company is valued, let's say, at a significant multiple to Kazia. So I think there is room for this kind of data to really resonate with investors, but it's going to be a relatively technical story to tell.